as Mrs. Iwu parked beside other cars in the compound. Before they could get out of the vehicle, people wearing uniformed clothes came rushing out. Meso was a bit scared, but Mrs. Iwu, noticing her apprehension, assured her that all was well, as they were home now. Meso was struck with awe as she gawked at the sheer size of the compound. Mrs. Iwu laid her hands gently on Meso's shoulders and led her into the building. When Meso got inside, she realized that the outside was nothing compared to the paradise her eyes were beholding. She refused to sit down on the pristine white chair for fear of staining it with her dirty clothes and body when Mrs. Iwu indicated that she should sit down. But Mrs. Iwu didn't seem to mind the state of her clothes. She gently prodded her until she sat down on the edge of the chair. Mrs. Iwu excused herself, and after what seemed like a long time in Meso's mind, she returned and told Meso to follow her. They went up a beautiful flight of stairs and walked down a short hallway that can only be described as movie-worthy. Meso at this point couldn't keep her mouth closed because of the beauty of the house. When they got to a door, Mrs. Iwu opened it and stood back to allow her enter first. When Meso stepped into the room, she was transported to the world of the princesses she often saw a glimpse of when she steals a glance at the television whenever her cousin Chidinma was watching her programs. She couldn't believe those places were real and that she was standing in one. She remembered her aunt Chinyere always shouted for someone to pinch her so she would be sure she was awake if something exciting was happening. So Mmeso pinched herself to be sure she was not still asleep under the tree by the market. But the pain reassured her of the reality of her environment. Mrs. Iwu pointed at a door at the far end of the room and told her to open it. When she did, it turned out to be a bathroom and toilet, the size of which was bigger than her aunt Chinyere's room. Mrs. Iwu told her to go in and freshen up, but she stood still where she was, scared again as she looked at the gadgets all over the place. She wasn't sure what to do with any of them, but Mrs. Iwu, again sensing the source of her agitation, went into the bathroom holding her by the hand and showed her how everything worked. Meso smiled shyly but gratefully at the kind woman. When she was alone, she removed her dirty clothes and folded them, putting them at one corner of the room. When she switched on the shower, just the way she had been shown, she was pleasantly surprised to feel warm water pouring out on her tired, battered body. After some minutes of enjoying the warmth of the water, she recollected where she was and got scared that she was wasting water, and she quickly scrubbed her body with the soap and sponge she was given, without stopping to enjoy the flowery scent of the soap. When she had rinsed her body, it now occurred to her that she had no change of clothes. After contemplating for a little while, she decided to put on the old clothes as she didn't want to appear greedy and ungrateful if she asked for new clothes. But she heard Mrs. Iwu's voice on the other side of the door, telling her to come out if she was done bathing. With the big soft towel tied securely around her thin chest, she clutched her old clothes and stepped out of the bathroom. She saw Mrs. Iwu standing by the bed with some clothes draped across both arms. Mrs. Iwu told her to drop her clothes on the floor and pick any one from the ones on her arms. She wasn't sure if that was okay because the kindness was new to her and she can't remember when someone had looked at her with so much kindness since her uncle became sick. But Mrs. Iwu walked towards her instead. When she saw her hesitate a little, She took the dirty clothes from her and gave her one of the new ones on her arms, telling her to wear them and come out, and she stepped out of the room. Meso looked around the room again, this time in greater detail, and she wished it was possible that it was hers, but she didn't for once think that it was ever going to be possible. And not wanting to start desiring for something that belonged to another, she instead made up her mind to work hard as she's growing up so that she will be able to afford whatever she wanted without anybody beating her or making her sleep on the floor like her aunt Chinyere did. When she stepped out of the room, she saw one of the uniformed people standing by the side, and looking around, she didn't see Mrs. Iwu anywhere, so she made to go back inside to wait for her there. But the lady spoke up and told her that Madam sent her to bring Meso. She introduced herself as Fumi and said she will be her personal maid from then on. Meso was wondering what was wrong with the lady as she addressed her as Miss. And again, why would she say she was her maid? Does a maid have a maid also? She wondered if this was another word that she has not heard of. As she was so young, so it is possible, and her uncle, who didn't mind her endless questions, wasn't around for her to ask. She was roused from her musings by the sound of footsteps coming up the stairs, and she hoped it was Mrs. Iwo. Yes, it turned out to be her. Mrs. Iwu looked at her carefully and smiled approvingly. She beckoned for her to come. When Meso got to where she was standing, Mrs. Iwu took her by the hand and led her downstairs to the dining table. She saw three dishes: jollof rice and turkey, noodles, eggs and hot dog, and spaghetti, her favorite things she didn't know how Mrs. Iwu found out she liked. She prepared them when she was in her aunt's place, but she never got to eat much then, unless on those few occasions where her uncle was around and they were prepared. Mrs. Iwu told her to sit and eat whatever she wanted, as much as she wanted. At this point, she had stopped doubting the realness of Mrs. Iwu's kindness, because without knowing why, she felt so safe around her, like she did with her Uncle Edison. So when she was asked to eat, she sat down and began with the noodles and turkey. But unfortunately, she couldn't eat much before her stomach became too full. Mrs. Iwu smiled as if she sensed her disappointment and told her that she can eat whatever she wanted to eat whenever she wanted it. Meso looked up at her, wondering what she meant by that. Mrs. Iwu told her to follow her to the sitting room, and when they were both seated, Mrs. Iwu asked her if she could like to stay with her until her uncle was discharged from the hospital. Without thinking, Meso jumped on the woman and exclaimed with joy. Mrs. Iwu held her tightly, and for the first time since her uncle got sick, Meso felt as if there was hope again. 3 weeks later, Mrs. Iwu called her one day to the sitting room downstairs and asked her if she was willing to go to a proper school, or would she like to continue with the lesson teacher that was already taking her in the evenings. Meso said whatever she decided was okay by her. Mrs. Iwu said if that was the case, then on Monday the following week, they would be going to check with the school close by to see if admission into JSS1 was still possible. When they got to the school, Meso was wondering if Mrs. Iwu forgot that she was just a junior student in class 1 and not yet in the university level, as a result of how big the school was in her eyes. She thought at that stage that surely no university could be bigger than what she was looking at right there. And she asked Mrs. Iwu. The woman busted out in laughter and told her this was just a secondary school. Meso's amazement knew no bounds. When they got to the proprietor's office, it was decided after much deliberation that if she's able to perform well in the tests that will be conducted, then she can be enrolled in the said class, since there was no previous record of academic performance available. After the test, Meso was told to wait at the reception while Mrs. Iwu was called alone into the office. Meso became so scared that she had failed woefully, but when she looked up, she saw Mrs. Iwu, the proprietor, and some persons coming towards her with broad smiles on their faces. Mrs. Iwu's being the broadest, her fear abated a little. When they got to where she was sitting, Mrs. Iwu lifted her from the chair and twirled her around with joy. When the excitement had been contained, she was told that she performed better than most JSS 3 students, that she can't be admitted into JSS 1, as that would be a demotion for her level of intelligence. After all their big drama, she was simply told that she would be resuming as a Junior 3 student, and if she performed within their expectation in the first term, she may be promoted to a senior class for the remaining 2 terms. It happened that she ended up spending 2.5 years in secondary school instead of 6, and in these 2 years she had kept touch with the news of her uncle's health. So after writing her senior leaving exams, she asked Mrs. Iwu, whom she had grown so fond of that she was now calling her mom, if they could go to check on her uncle, as it had been 2 months she last visited. When they got to the convalescent center, they were told that her uncle had been discharged and there was no return address, as the man had miraculously recovered his mobility. And being that they had been taking care of his bills anonymously, there was no way they could be contacted at his discharge. So Mrs. Ewood suggested they pay a visit to their place of residence. On getting there, they were told that the family had relocated and nobody seemed to know their current address. Meso was heartbroken, and the joy she felt at the news of her uncle's recovery was shadowed by the fear which became lodged in her heart that she may never be able to see her uncle again. But her mom, Mrs. Iwu, assured her that they would do all within their power to locate her uncle and his family. 10 years later, Meso, now fully adopted by Mr. and Mrs. Iwu, being that they had no biological children of their own, was busy managing her parents' company with guidance from both parents, but her brilliance in finance and her ability to learn humbly had skyrocketed the profit of the organization in the 2 years she was their CEO, more than they have seen in the last 10 years. And this pushed her pictures and images out so much that she became a household name. One day, she was returning from the office, exhausted, so she rested her head back as she relaxed at the back seat of the car. But within a few moments, she heard a loud bang as she was jerked forward with the impact. When she was able to get herself, she realized that her car had been hit from behind. When she got down along with her driver, she found a young man and an elderly woman kneeling beside him in front of her vehicle. She went first to check the damage done and came to them asking them to stand up before she will allow them speak. After much persuasion, they both stood, and the woman was pleading with her. And then all of a sudden she stopped and looked at Meso closely. And after a while, she shouted, "Meso!" That was when Meso looked at the two people before her, and she herself realized with shock that that was her aunt and her cousin Obina. They made to hug her, but Mmeso quickly stepped back, escaping from their outstretched arms. And immediately they knelt down again crying. But Mmeso was not in the mood for the scene they were causing, as traffic was already building. So she told them to clear the shuttle bus they were driving to the side of the road. But the vehicle couldn't start, so they had to push it with the help of some bystanders. When their vehicle had been parked out of the way, Mmeso told them to enter her car, and she instructed the driver to take them to the nearest eatery. After they had ordered and had eaten, Mmeso got to the only reason why she spared them any time: her uncle. When she asked after him, her Aunt Chinyere busted out in tears, and as a result couldn't talk. So Mmeso turned to Obinna for explanation, and Obinna began to narrate their ordeal since she was thrown out. According to him, their father lost his job as a result of his long recovery period. If not for a kind stranger who paid for his hospital bills, they didn't know how they would have been able to offset it all, as their mother's salary as a police officer was not sufficient to take care of their needs. So after he was discharged, they could no longer afford to pay for the house they were living in. So they found a smaller accommodation and moved out. Their father never forgave them for abandoning her, and he made sure they all felt the brunt of his anger until his death. Mmeso instantly broke down in tears on hearing that her beloved uncle had died, confirming her fears all these years. And in tears, she asked how he died. Obinna said their dad never stopped looking for her, even after they had relocated. He kept going around their old neighborhood to see if he could see her. He even came back one day happy that their former neighbor told him that Mmeso came looking for them one day with a woman. We never believed him, but we couldn't object either. If not, it will worsen our situation with him. Obinna continued. So after months of him going back to see if he would come back without success, he became heartbroken, and one day he slept and never woke up. Mmeso's resentment of her aunt and her children was intensified with this heartbreaking story of how her uncle died so pitifully. She stood from the table angrily, paid for the food, and walked away, without a backward glance at her aunt, who was running behind her, trying to catch up. As she entered her vehicle, she told the driver to drive off. Few weeks later, while relaxing by the pool to get much deserved rest on a Saturday, contemplating on what to get her parents for their upcoming anniversary, a shadow fell across her face, and when she opened her eyes, she saw her mom's beautiful face staring down at her lovingly. It never ceases to amaze her how her mom looks at her as if she was the best thing in the whole world. She doesn't think she will ever get used to the feeling of being loved so completely and unquestionably. Mrs. Iwu mentioned for her to her, and she sat up, making room for her to sit as well. When they had gisted about random things for a few minutes, her mom's countenance changed a bit, and Imeso became instantly worried, and she asked her mom what the problem would be. But Mrs. Iwu smiled sadly, looking into her eyes. She held Imeso's hand and said she had a favor to ask. Imeso, without a second thought, answered immediately that she would do anything for her mom. So her mom replied that it was a very difficult thing she was about to ask, but Imeso insisted that she would do it. All she wanted was to get that sadness off her champion's face. After a little hesitation, Mrs. Iwu finally said that what she wanted was to ask Imeso to forgive her aunt and her cousins for what they did to her. Imeso immediately withdrew her hand from her mom's hands and stood up from the chair. As she made to walk away, she turned back to her mom and said, I am sorry, mommy. I can't do what you are asking me. I mean, anything at all you ask for, I would have done it, but this one is beyond me. And all of a sudden, all the tears she never cried for her uncle, the memories of their wickedness, the cruelty of her uncle's death came crashing down on her. She couldn't be strong anymore. She just collapsed on the floor and wept like she has never done before. Her mom just sat down beside her, stroking her hair, saying nothing, even as tears also ran down her face. Because though she never interacted with the said uncle, but her daughter's memories of him gave her a very good idea of the kind of man he was and how grieved her baby must feel. When Meso had no more tears left, she laid down, putting her head on her mom's laps, and together they sat in silence as they were both swamped by the heaviness they felt. Her mom never spoke of her aunt again. Some months later, Meso came to her mom to ask her why she suddenly requested for her to forgive her aunt and her cousins, because Meso never told her mom of her discovery after she met her aunt and Obina, as not to upset her. Her mom told her that Chidinma and Obinna traced her to the house a week before she made that request and told her everything, but she didn't tell Mmeso because she knew that Mmeso was not ready, especially after her reaction at her request for forgiveness. So Mmeso asked to know why they never came back. Her mom replied that she gave them some money and told them never to contact her again, as Mmeso will look for them when she is ready. So they agreed and left after they had dropped their current address. After hearing this from her mom, she realized how much her mom respected and believed in her. So she made up her mind to become a better person to those who killed her uncle and nearly succeeded at killing her too. She collected the address from her mom, and when she asked if she could come with her, Meso said no, that she needed to do this alone. So she went to her aunt's house one weekend that her calendar was free. Fortunately, they were all in the house except for the last boy, who they said went to play ball. When they made to go out and call him back, Meso told them not to bother. She confronted them about the maltreatment they meted out against her and the resentment she feels over the death of her uncle, even though he was their biological father, but he was her father too, and it was as a result of their wickedness that he died the way he did. She told them that she had forgiven them, but she doesn't want anything to do with them again, but she will help them in her little way. They were really grateful to her, even though they felt grieved at the loss of her. She helped the last boy, Michael, go professional in his football as she knows how talented he really was. Gave Obina a contact which gave him a well-paying job. Paid for Chidima's baking class, and when she was done learning, helped her to open a very big bakery. Their mom she put on a salary that can help take care of her comfortably. And after she was done setting them up, she cut off from all of them and later got married and had three beautiful children who her parents enjoyed spoiling.